Daniel, good afternoon to you. And this is a clear message that President Ramaphosa is sending, that people cannot act with impunity. But is the sanction enough?
Hello, Jeremy. Well, I think better some sanction than no sanction. So at the very least now we've seen the president crack, I suppose, a partial whip when it comes to this matter. You can't have double standards in South Africa. You can't expect millions of South Africans to put their lives on hold and face economic peril if the leadership at the top don't come to the party as well. And I think that whilst some might see the sanction as being insufficient, it does leave the door open for perhaps other legal proceedings to be taken against this particular minister. But I think it is perhaps, it is a naming and shaming, and that's what we've seen. This minister has now had her own reputation quite severely dented by this particular issue. And once again, it shows that in a time of crisis, you can rise to the occasion or you can damage your reputation. And I think this is a case of reputational damage for that minister.
But surely this tells all South Africans that you can transgress and that you will just get away with a slap on the wrist.
Well, I think that's the conundrum, I suppose, the president is in, and it is a similar conundrum to many other issues that he faces, excluding the issue of the coronavirus. The issue of how he appoints ministers, the political power brokers that they might be, the supporting factions that might support them remain an issue. So, in fact, there may still be constraints for the president on exactly how he deals with these ministers, because the fundamentals are that he is still a president who is beholden unto various factions within his own party, and he has to tread a fine line in terms of how he deals with them, even under these extraordinary conditions.
Is the Economic Freedom Fighters Party being opportunistic when it lays criminal charges?
Well, I think opposition parties have woken up, because what happens during a time of crisis like this is that government suck out the oxygen out of the airwaves. Everything is about the government's response, the ANC's response. And there's been little opportunity for both the DA and the EFF, for that matter, to make any kind of public pronouncements during the course of the last 12 days or so. So it's a chance for them to rear their head again and perhaps to reintroduce themselves to the South African public, since most of us have been fed a diet of cabinet ministers regularly on our television for the last nearly 2 weeks.
Daniel Silk, I guess the severity of the broader situation right now renders this just one element of the 24-hour news cycle. We'll move on from it. The president handled it very, very quickly. No real damage, I guess, to the executive, but it would send out a very clear message to other cabinet ministers to be careful, and also to be careful in what they say.
Well, absolutely. It is a message, and it also extends some authority to President Ramaphosa. This is a president who has been accused prior to the virus issues of being rather wishy-washy. It's afforded him an opportunity to exert his authority. Now, one might want him to exert his authority on issues beyond COVID-19, but at the very least, we are seeing him flex some sort of muscle, albeit in a rather limited way. And once again, it does offer him the opportunity to come across as something of a more decisive leader than many of us have argued that he hasn't been in the course of the last 12 months or so. It can work to his favor.
But he still is dealing with the fringes of the problem so far. If you listened to the health minister some time back saying that this is still the calm before the storm, if things go south, this could be a huge test of the president's leadership going forward.
Well, of course, how he deals with his cabinet is one issue, but how he deals with a broader COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa is another, and he faces probably the most difficult test over the course of the last few months, and that is whether to extend the lockdown, to tweak the lockdown, or to diminish the lockdown more or less entirely. Now, that's a decision that could have substantial ramifications. If he decides to end the lockdown, perhaps temporarily, he faces the possibility of a spike in cases. And if he extends the lockdown, he faces the possibility of substantial and further economic damage to the country. So here's a decision that's probably as much bigger, frankly, than the sanctioning of another cabinet minister. It's about jobs, it's about the economy, it's about our GDP, and that decision is perhaps going to be the issue that really makes or breaks him. And not only him, I might add, it's not only a South African issue, it's one that most global leaders are now, I think, having sleepless nights about.
Essentially, lives versus the economy in South Africa then, Daniel Silk, and this is a last question to you. How close are we then to that fulcrum?
Well, I think obviously the 21-day deadline is close upon us. There's probably a good case to be made for some sort of extension to the lockdown. Countries can only handle so long of a lockdown. The morale issue is important. The psychological effect on people are important. And therefore, it may be that we see some sort of tweak of an extension, allowing some sectors to slowly creep back to normal. And I would argue that's probably the better way of doing it, rather than extend the fairly draconian regulations that we have now. But again, the science, the data is going to have to dictate how the president acts.
Political commentator Daniel Silk in Cape Town, thank you very much for joining us.